Okay, so today I am talking to Sue Leather and Jez Uden, who have a new book out on extensive reading. So thank you both very much for joining me.
You're welcome. It's good to be here.
Nice to be here.
Yeah, especially at these rather strange times, the three of us different time zones. So the reason that your book, Extensive Reading, lovely cover here, by the way. Very nice. Some kind of insect just attacked me. The reason it caught my attention is because I just finished writing a book and we were looking at effective research-based interventions for teachers. And one of the ones that did come up was extensive reading and the amount of research and kind of the amount of people saying how effective the approach was kind of like quite remarkable. Many different areas of teaching that it could help to improve. So I'm going to hopefully talk to you about this book and the research a little bit later. But just before that, could I ask you both to introduce yourself for people who might not know who you are? Maybe ladies first.
Okay, thanks, Russ. So my name is Sue Leather. I'm a consultant, trainer and writer. I have a consultancy group which supports large projects in different parts of the world. But I spend quite a lot of time these days writing as well. And I'm based now in Vancouver on the west coast of Canada. But as you can hear from my accent probably, I originally come from the UK. So come from near Manchester.
And you've probably written more books on for graded readers than anyone else, so I think. Yeah, I'm Jez. So basically, I've been involved in ELT for probably over 20 years now. I started off as a teacher, like most people, and worked my way up, became a teacher trainer. I've been a director of schools in probably 6 or 7 different countries now, from the Far East to the Middle East to Europe and the UK. Yeah, I've probably been involved in just about every sort of thing going in ELT, including research, which is what's brought us together and produced this book. And I think me and Sue met each other probably over 10 years ago now, was it, Sue?
Yeah.
Where I was running book clubs for foreign language students in the UK. And they all just fell in love with Sue Leather's books. And they'd written sort of little reviews on a blog that I'd got at the time, and then Sue got in touch, and it was great. And they were actually writing, some of my students were writing to Sue, and she was responding, and it was a really good sort of thing we had going there. And then me and Sue sort of got to know each other a bit better, and then this opportunity came up to write the book, and actually got us working together for the first time. So that's what's brought us here now.
Great, it's great. Well, it's a very enjoyable book, very interesting. I've been looking forward to reading it, and yeah, I've enjoyed it. It's basically divided into 4 parts, and it's, I would say, a very kind of practical book. A lot of the main part of it is activities for teachers. But right at the start, there is a section on research and talking about the research. I want to talk about that first, because that's kind of my main area of interest. So extensive reading has been shown, as we just said previously, to have a lot of benefits, and is very effective for language learning. So could you just briefly talk about what some of the benefits are according to research?
Sure, yeah. So, I mean, the main thing is extensive reading will help improve reading first and foremost. You know, we get to be better readers by reading a lot. And then, of course, there's the vocabulary development, which is well known in research. And as vocabulary grows, it makes more books accessible so people can read more. That leads to, it's kind of a reciprocal process. The more vocabulary you get, the better you get at reading. The better you get at reading, the more vocabulary you develop, and so on. But the conditions have to be right. So it's important that people are reading at the right levels. So it's at comprehensible levels. And that means being aware of, well, understanding at least 98%, this is what the research is telling us, of the words actually in the text. You can get away with a little less, with a bit of background knowledge or other skills, but sort of between 95 and 98% is what you need to know for comprehension to take place, and then for incidental pickup to occur. So that's what's important. It's really essential that the conditions are right for those vocabulary sort of gains to take place. And then there needs to be enough repetitions for that vocabulary acquisition to take place as well. So that's important. And then, you know, you've got improvements with syntax and word associations, and it develops words that are already partially known as well, things like spelling and things. So you get all those gains from reading and reading a lot, but you do have to read a lot. It's not sort of an overnight sort of, you know, quick gain process. But yeah, vocabulary is obviously one of the big gains you get from reading, from extensive reading.
I'm just going to cut in there to say, yeah, that chimes with both what I'd read as well, and also like my own experience of learning a second language. So first I learned Japanese first, and I read a lot, and I feel like my Japanese is much better than my Chinese, which I didn't do much reading, and perhaps wasn't as motivated. And yeah, one of the things you mentioned was syntax, and I think grammar is something that I guess the exposure to certain forms kind of will have an influence at some point, and you'll become very familiar with the way that language is laid out, and certain collocations and certain phrases, and that's going to have some effect on
yeah.
Exactly. Yeah, and things that are being taught in the class, grammar points that are being taught in a class, if the reading's at the right level after that, students will recognize those structures and become more familiar with them, and then become fluent with them. And that's the other thing. It's like word recognition becomes quicker, and that develops like automaticity, that sort of instant words, and then fluency. Yeah. So yeah, it all ties in.
I think it's very difficult to get enough. If you go to a normal sort of language class, or you know, you're exposed to language and to the new language in that way, it's very difficult to get the amount of exposure you need to the language in order for it to become automatic. And I think that's where extensive reading comes in as a way of just immersing the student in the language.
Yeah, and I keep seeing more and more research coming out that kind of collocations or phrases are a kind of marker for what people consider to be fluency. So I think I've seen one on speaking, and when they kind of removed all the variables for why these markers were giving high scores, it was because they had a lot of kind of set phrases or well collocated phrases.
Yeah.
And also from my own experience, I guess, like if you know the way the language works, if you're familiar with the kind of normal way people use language or phrases, then listening becomes easier, because you kind of have a feeling, and reading, because you have a feeling for what's coming next in a sentence.
Well, there was an amazing study done by Patsy Lightbound, who's not really known for her extensive reading sort of involvement, but you might be aware of the one that she did in Canada.
You mentioned it in the book, 2002, right? It's an incredible study. I'm really glad you brought it up, because I wanted to talk about that study.
It's quite hard to get hold of, because it was done, I think it was...
hard to get hold of, yeah.
I think it might have been in the 80s, the original study, and but it's...
I couldn't find that study, so I was really...
No, it's hard to get hold of. I think it's Canadian Modern Language Journal, something like that. And it took me a long time to get hold of it. But yeah, it wasn't published digitally, so it's pretty tricky to get. But it was an amazing study, and it seems to have floated below the radar, probably for those reasons. But for me, it's one of my favorite studies with this, because it's a longitudinal study for a start. It was done over several years. And it was basically kids in New Brunswick, I think in Canada, that couldn't get access to the schools. There weren't enough places left. And so they came up with this idea to create these like language labs, where the kids could access all the books they wanted which came with cassettes as well. So they could sit down and listen and read or just listen for 30 minutes every day. And this went on for 5 years, I think, 5 or 6 years. And after the first year, the other kids, by the way, that are getting regular tuition, were getting 30 minutes a day audiolingual with a teacher. And they compared them, the two groups, after a year. The ones that were just reading, no teacher at all, were performing just as well on all standards as the ones that had a teacher and were getting the actual classes 30 minutes each day.
Yeah.
And this included speaking.
Yeah.
Okay, so that was the surprising thing for me with this. And then they measured them again 3 years later. And again, they were hitting all the same sort of levels as the control group, the ones that were getting the audiolingual classes every day with a teacher. And the only thing that was starting to dip, I think at that stage, was the writing.
Yeah. And
then 5 or 6 years later, the writing was quite a lot lower than the groups that had tuition, but everything else was still up there. So I think, one thing that came out of this for me was imagine what it's not to say we don't need teachers, but imagine what they would have achieved if they had a teacher as well, and on top of that. But I think the implications from that study were quite profound for me, and certainly one of my favorite studies. So the fact that it knocked onto the other language skills as well, not just the reading. So, yeah. I think that's a good study that is kind of summarized in the book.
Yes.
But get your hands on the original, then great.
Yeah, I mean, if you've got a digital copy and you can send it to me, I'd be very grateful. But
I'll try and find it. Yeah.
I think it's, page 104 in the book,
right?
If anybody wants to check it out. So the other thing, just talking about research, the kind of subheading of the book is the role of motivation. And so there is quite a lot of research, or at least quite a lot of references to the research on motivation. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about why motivation was such a big part of this book, and some of the kind of, interaction between motivation and extensive reading.
Perhaps I can talk about, why we were motivated to talk about motivation, and then maybe Jess can pick up on the research a bit. I think when Jess and I started talking about extensive reading, we're both on the same page in terms of, the research shows that it's the best thing since sliced bread, et cetera, et cetera. And we started talking about the missing link and what that is. And we came to the conclusion, I guess, that motivation, getting teachers to use extensive reading in the classroom and getting students motivated to read, those seem to be the missing links. Because if it's so good, why are people not actually doing it? And so that was the kind of initial motivation for us to start thinking about that and researching it.
Yeah, and I think teachers as well, motivating teachers to, I've known so many teachers that have kind of bought into the idea of extensive reading, but still aren't doing it, and so, yeah, it's like motivating teachers and students to really sort of get going with this, because like Sue's just said, we believe passionately in extensive reading, and, the potential that it has in terms of like linguistic gains and lots of other gains as well is just incredible. And it is, surprising that it's just not being utilized more. And this has been going on for decades now. I think it was Day and Bamford with their great book in '98, I think it was, Extensive Reading in the Second Language Classroom. We were talking about it back then, that got the conversation really started as far as I was concerned. And then Grabe made a passionate plea for it in 2009 with one of the best books on extensive reading I've read. It's an incredible book. And he's like saying back then that there's not enough research for motivation and extensive reading, and there still isn't. And this is like more than 10 years later after that book. So that's been challenging. And in fact, that was one of the challenges with the book, that there is a lack of research in L2, extensive reading and motivation. And a lot of what we drew from was from first language research and applying it to what we already know. And I've got a bit of experience with research in second language reading, and sort of trying to bring it all together to get this conversation started, really, and hopefully provide a platform for researchers to start picking up on some of these things and see where we go from here. So that was really, for me, one of the biggest motivators for this, like, just to touch on what Sue said.
You do actually have a section at the end of the book, which is kind of asking, I mean, it's not necessarily for researchers, but asking teachers to maybe take some of these ideas and research them in their classroom, and I guess an action research section. So,
the idea is to get teachers more interested in doing little bits of research in their own classroom and finding out, showing themselves really that the effects and how good they can be, and hopefully it will we'll get some kind of virtuous cycle out of that.
Yeah, and the researching doesn't necessarily have to be this very elaborate thing.
No.
I think it's classroom action research.
Action research in the classroom. Yeah.
I noticed one of the series editors is Anne Burns. Did that have an influence on the action?
I think in the format of because all the books in the series have this same format with 4 areas, and I think the last section is on research from implementation to research.
Yeah, good title.
So there we are. Yeah.
So you just talked about, you just touched on this, Sue, and that is the fact that there's a kind of, I don't know what you'd call it, a discord or gap between the fact that the research says this is really effective, and yet people just aren't doing it. People like me, I know, I've seen the research and I know what the claims are made about it, but I just don't do it. So why? Why are teachers not doing more extensive reading?
I think one of the things that really stood out for me, and it was something I picked up from doing the research for this book, but something that obviously I was aware of before, is this notion of cost. It's to do something new, you usually have to give something else up, and it's that sort of constraint, I think, that makes it difficult for teachers. They're working with busy curriculums, they've got to prepare students for exams, and they're thinking, where do I fit the time in? What am I going to have to lose in order to put in extensive reading into the curriculum? And I think that's difficult for teachers. For students to read outside of the classroom, it's like usually there's mountains of homework for them to be getting on with and stuff, and or friends to see, or groups and clubs to go to and things, and where do they fit the time in to do this? It is a time-consuming process, reading. Sit down and read for at least 30 minutes, you'd think. So it's like, what do people have to give up in order to do this? And do they value it enough in order to sacrifice something else? I think that's one of the things. So this notion of cost, I think, was quite important for me. And we touch on that in the book. So then it really comes down to how much people value it in terms of, like you've said, you've read the research, you think it's really important. So now it's like, I know it's really important. So what can I do to fit this in to the already busy curriculum? And then the other thing is that teachers often feel they want to be teaching, and the extensive reading is the opposite of that, is kind of, stepping back really and allowing people just to sit there and read. And I think sometimes teachers feel they need to be doing more and doing something, or to be seen doing something. So it's again that sort of cost, isn't it? And then sorry,
I was just going to pick up on what you said, because I think linked to that kind of teachers want to be doing something, there's it's really hard to test extensive reading. So often teachers are supposed to be testing what they're teaching. How do you test extensive reading? It's more difficult than discrete items. So I think that kind of, the backwash of tests and exams is quite detrimental to extensive reading.
That's a really good point. I think the thing is with grammar, even for students themselves, when they see that they've learned a new grammar point, they can see it physically and very quickly. Whereas with extensive reading, they don't see the benefits that easily. It's a lot more subtle, and for teachers as well. So that can be a bit challenging in terms of motivation, because you don't physically see those gains as easily as you would with perhaps learning a new grammar point, for example.
I think I have a memory of probably 2012. I came to a university in Japan and I decided I wanted to do extensive reading, and the library had hundreds of readers at different levels. I don't know why, but they just, and nobody was using them, but there were hundreds of them, shelves and shelves of these reading. I'm going to do it. And then the problem kind of occurred to me as to like, well, how to do it, you know, like the actual practical application of, you know, what are they going to do? Well, they're going to read, okay. And then the next thought was, well, how do I know that they are reading? You know, that I give them some homework. I think I gave them 3 books a week they had to read, which was a random number I completely pulled out of the air. And I think I made them keep a diary and write who the book was by and what the story was or something. And I just checked it. And there was no test or anything like that. But I think for me anyway, at that time, the implementation was the biggest problem. But you do have quite a lot of suggestions in the book for implementation.
Yeah. Yeah, that's right. I mean, what we've done in the book is to give teachers ideas about how they can monitor, how they can, you know, set up goal conferences, talk to their students about setting goals, kind of monitor it, that kind of thing. So basically lesson plans and formats that they can use, so it's easy for them to just copy the format, use the format. Because we realize that that's one of the issues that what you just described, I think, is very common among teachers who want to use extensive reading. How do I, you know, it's so amorphous. How do I actually get to see what they've done? How do I monitor them? So hopefully teachers will feel that they're actually doing something in this process as well, you know, that they're not just sitting back. And because as Jess said before, that's one of the worries I think that teachers have.
Yeah, and just to sort of emphasize the part on giving learner conferences, that's like you arrange a little sort of moment to have a chat with someone about the book they've been reading, see how they're getting on, see if there's any troubles, if they say the book's a little too hard. I think that the main thing is to give positive reinforcement regardless, you know, to keep that motivation up. If they're reading something that's too hard, well, that's fine. Let's find something easier and reset the goals. You know, if you tried to read 5 chapters this week and couldn't manage it, well, let's just bring it back a little bit to 3. Let's go for something a bit more achievable. And just keeping that positive reinforcement with the learners. So they're feeling encouraged and, you know, ready to go again with the next stage of their reading. But not to be afraid to swap a book if it is too hard, or if they're not interested in it. That's another thing. They should have the choice to swap a book, you know, like we do when we're reading regular books. It's, you know, you don't like it, you put it down, you get another one. So I think it's important not to put any pressures on students to think that they have to, you know, finish the book that they're reading. If they're not interested in it, they should be fine to swap it for something else. So yeah, I think that's important. But what you were saying earlier about you had so many books and how do you implement that? I mean, you're at a lucky stage that you've got so many books. There's a lot of people who don't. And then you've got the financial cost of trying to sort of buy them, which is yet another constraint. So, you know, there's other ways of trying. Sorry.
Actually, so I was going to say on that point, the book actually offers or suggests various ways of getting around not having any books. Could you talk a little bit about that for teachers who are watching?
Well, I was a little bit cheeky years ago. So I had, these were with adult groups, so it was a bit easier to sort of do it with. I don't suggest doing this with kids in the class who are sort of not adults. But I had about 20 ESOL students in a class. And I got each of them to buy 1 book each. So eventually we had a library of 20 books.
Right.
And they'd each read different books and then swap them when they'd finished. And that sort of worked very well. And then we get to the stage, I actually had a bit of a discount going with Cambridge at the time. So I'd be making these like little orders with several classes at a time, but I got everyone reading. Everyone was interested. We'd have this like moment where I think it was like kind of drop everything and read sort of approach. You know, we'd find this like moment in the class where I don't know, it just feels right just to stop things now. Right, let's just do 10, 15 minutes of reading. Okay, pick up your books, off you go. Just silent reading for 15 minutes. So that was one way that that I did it for no cost to myself or the school. The students just paid for one book but had access to 20, or just carried it on like that. So that was one way of doing it.
That's a really nice idea. Yeah. Okay. So another thing I wanted to ask you about was going back to the research, whether or not there was anything that you found kind of surprising. Personally, I was reading one section where you noted that please correct me if I get this wrong, but the comprehension rates for students who read books online or material online was somewhat lower, or a little bit lower than.
That was interesting. I mean, this is one thing that would be really good for more research, really, because there's not a lot, and that came from, I think it was Marianne Wolf's book. She picked up on that, and I think it was a study. Was it Jenny Monomore or something? I can't remember what the book was that they studied, but they did this study where some students would read that book online and the others read the paperback, and the ones that read the paperback could reconstruct the story chronologically much better than those who read it online. And she was talking about the fact that you have this kinesthetic separation, I think, from reading online, and also that you tend to read in shorter bursts when you read online, rather than sort of getting absorbed into the deeper reading that you do with a book. So those kind of little sort of shorter bursts stop you from getting into that kind of flow, and that sort of deeper state where you're losing yourself in a book. I don't know too much about this from a research point of view. I've put it into the book based on what Marianne Wolf was talking about, but that's something that I think would really sort of warrant further research, especially when technology is getting so much better now as well. These things might get outdated very quickly. So I'm sure things are getting better with iPads and Kindles and everything. But certainly the idea of the kinesthetic separation, where you can't actually see how far you are through the book physically, could certainly have an impact on motivation. I can see that.
Or sitting at a desk or whatever, reading rather than like in your bed, bath or whatever.
Well, that's another thing. Sorry, Sue.
I was just saying it makes sense. That would be more difficult somehow.
I could understand that it was I guess less enjoyable as an experience, but the test results showing a kind of lower rate of comprehension was really interesting. And I should say maybe the actual engagement in the text was related to the enjoyment of the whole experience, as it were.
I think so. I think it's just they've sort of found that it's a less of a connective experience, isn't it? With so like you say, it's less engagement, and but I'm sure some people will differ. And there were some researchers, I can't remember off the top of my head who they were, that was saying that it can be more motivating, especially for the younger generations reading online, because that's pretty much become the new literacy now. That and I think someone at some stage said that we read about 100,000 words a day, which is more than the average book, just scrolling through news items on phone.
That was interesting.
I'm not sure if I included that in the book in the end, but it's an awful lot of reading that you're actually doing, although it's not like reading a book start to finish, but that's how much you're consuming through digital means on a daily basis. So
I suppose the thing is that they're short pieces as well. I mean, I think I suppose extensive reading, you're expecting students to sit down for a length of time, even if it's only 15 minutes, probably is longer than the time they usually spend looking at any given thing. So we're kind of fighting the zeitgeist a bit, I think.
I mean, it'd be my assumption that for fact-based reading rather than fiction would probably be more suited in terms of like getting the comprehension rates an appropriate level with reading online. But I don't know. I mean, some people seem to do it quite successfully and enjoy it more, and don't like reading paperback books at all. So, yeah. I mean, from a motivational point of view, whatever works for me is fine. Whatever anyone will do to sort of get engaged with reading is great. So I'm not anti sort of reading online at all. I don't want to come across like that.
I think one thing.
Sorry.
No, sorry.
I was just going to say, certainly from a comprehension point of view, that's very important. You know, learners need to be reading at the right levels and making sure that they're comprehending the text that they are reading. And if reading online is causing an issue there, then that's something that needs to be taken into account. So it's certainly something to be aware of, I think. And I think we just have to approach it with a bit of digital wisdom. So
yeah, it needs to be engaged reading. I mean, one thing that really came home to me when we were writing the book, which I kind of known before, but we really kind of stressed, was the fact that students should be reading things that they're really interested in. So finding out what they're interested in. You know, they don't have to be reading literature. They can be reading fact-based things. They can be reading about nature, about geography, history, biography, and then they can be reading stories. So actually finding out what students are interested in and working with that, I think is really important. And I think we're lucky because we live in an age where, you know, there's so many graded readers in the world of different types that teachers can choose, that students can choose. So I think that was something that for me really came home to me when we were writing the book.
Yeah, going back to your original question about surprises in this, I think that was one for me, the amount that we do read online, and I'm probably as guilty as anyone with that. But I think that the biggest surprise was the lack of research in second language motivation and extensive reading. Not L2 motivation, there's quite a lot on that, but specifically to extensive reading. It made it tricky, you know. It really felt like we were going right to the ground level to sort of start from scratch, and like I say, get this conversation started. But that made it quite exciting in a way. So trying to sort of combine that research with our current knowledge as well of extensive reading in a second language. So that was one thing. But the other thing that really sort of stood out for me was this notion that interest can be developed, because a lot of people, you know, I've done numerous talks as a Sue on extensive reading, and one of the things that sort of tends to come back a lot is that, you know, my students they're not interested in it, they don't want to read or something like that. But it's so important, it's a big thing, and I'm sure a lot of students aren't really interested in grammar either and don't find those things so exciting either, but they do it because they value it and it's important. They know it's going to help them develop their language. And what we're arguing is that extensive reading is just as important too. It needs its place at the table. Yeah. But yeah, this idea that interest can be developed was really big for me. And it was research of Heidi and Renninger, I think, from Scandinavia. I'd never heard of them before, so this was all new. And I got so fascinated, I ended up going down a bit of a rabbit hole with that. But they were really interesting. And they came up with this 4-phase development for interest, how to develop interest. And it all starts with situational interest and creating a situation where it engages people. And this is where we come in as teachers, you know, because we can do that in the classroom. And it's happening a lot in other schools, especially in the US, in first language context, especially, where they'll engage people in a topic, the classroom in a topic, by either some sort of experiment in the classroom or taking them out on a field trip. I think there was one example where the class went out to see to the woods. They found owl pellets, which are, I don't know if you know what these are. I learned this as well from doing this research. A regurgitated sort of food that the owl consumed, but all the bones and fluff and fur and stuff that they can't digest all gets spat out in a pellet. And the kids will find these pellets in the woods, take them back to the classroom and dissect them and find what the owl's been eating. And then they generate their own questions, but it creates this interest. You know, kids love all that sort of stuff. And they get all this interest going and ask more questions about what owls eat, how they hunt. And then the teacher gathers all these questions and gets these student-generated questions up on the wall. And then that motivates them to go and read and find the answers to all their own questions. And so that sort of creating that interest and getting learners motivated in the first place, I thought was terrific. And of course, a lot of teachers can't just take their kids out to do little field trips like that. But there's other things, use of video and stuff that they can do in the classroom to help generate situational interest and trigger that initial interest. Is so important. And then once the students are interested in a particular topic, or even if they've just started reading and getting interested in reading, it's about maintaining that situational interest. So that's like the next step. And that can be done through collaborative tasks and things, and typical tasks that we do in the classroom with students, get them in groups working together and creating that sort of sense of belonging and making an environment where reading is valued in the classroom. Where people feel that it's okay to read and it's good to read, because there's another thing, people sometimes don't feel comfortable reading. It's not a part of who they are. They don't think it's cool to have a book, or I think something that came up in the research is that girls have more of a kind of interest for romance novels, but boys wouldn't want to be seen with a romance novel.
That was so interesting. It was there was, I think, a category school issues, and girls were far more interested in books on school issues than boys.
Possibly, yeah. So it was interesting, but it just brings this whole idea that we need to allow choice in the classroom, allow people to read the things they're interested in. If it's a topic that we're setting for the class or the curriculum, make sure it's something that everyone's interested in and go from there. But creating an environment where people feel comfortable, where there's a lot of support and people feel that sense of togetherness, so no one's feeling excluded. Generating that interest, maintaining that interest through collaborative strategies and tasks. And then hopefully the more and more people do that, the more engaged they get into reading, the more they have exciting, interesting sort of moments with reading, there's a chance that they'll develop this individual interest in reading and hopefully go on to become long-term So that's the kind of idea. And that came from Heidi and Reniger's research on interest development. That for me was great. I loved that. And I had to reduce that so much in the end because I was just writing too much on it. But I was fascinated by it, and I just found it terrific. And there has been research done following that situational interest approach. I think it was Guthrie and his colleagues with their CORI approach, which is concept-orientated reading instruction, I think, something like that. And they basically took that situational interest thing with their kind of projects and then developed maintained interest and found that it does develop and help promote motivation in reading. So that was the big thing for me, really, when I came across that. So yeah, that was probably, I don't know if it was a surprise or just an exciting moment, but okay. I think it's sort of
great.
Comes into that category. Yeah.
How about you, Sue? Was there anything in the research which particularly stands out?
I think there are things that just, as we went through the process, became more evident in my mind. It became more stressed. I mean, I've written 35 readers or something, but I hadn't really, and although I work with word lists and all the rest of it, I hadn't really thought about it in terms of percentages. You know, it seems obvious, but the fact that if they're between 2 and 5% words, there should be 2 and 5% words that are that are not within level, right, for students to read. Otherwise, it becomes quite impossible for them to read. And I think that is really quite important, because I think that students often probably are trying to read books which are above level. And you know, that may be very off-putting. And thinking about my own experience, kind of reading, you know, trying to read Italian or, you know, Spanish or whatever it is really off-putting if you come across loads and loads of words that you don't understand. So things like that kind of just brought home to me, you know, what reading is all about and what teachers need to be aware of when they're choosing books for students, or when they're allowing students to read books, to choose books.
Yeah, for sure. That's so important, that teachers are aware of this and make sure that they're providing materials at the right levels for the students. Otherwise, there's no chance of motivating them to read. The key thing, and this was another thing, the 4 kind of stages for chapter 1 really are based around 4 questions. And the first one is, can I do this task? You know, and focusing on learner beliefs. They have to believe they can read it. You know, we're very rarely motivated to do something we can't do. You know, we enjoy doing things that we know we can do. And that's really important when it comes to reading. And like Sue said, you know, anything less than 5% of unknown words in the text, it becomes really, really difficult. Unless you're bringing a significant amount of background knowledge to that text, it's going to be incredibly difficult. And I think it was, I can't remember which study it was one by Paul Nation. I mean, he's been prolific on this kind of research for decades now. But I think he found that less than 90%, no one gained adequate comprehension of a text. So that's not knowing what you have to know between 95 and 98% of the words in the text itself. Less than that becomes problematic. Less than 90%, nobody achieved adequate comprehension. So
I've seen the 98 figure before. Yeah, I'm not sure. I'm always curious when I see the figure about, you know, how precisely that will map onto every text in every situation, and the kind of ways he went about measuring it. But I'm guessing it's a very useful kind of heuristic, at least, for saying, you know, if you give a student a text with a lot of unknown words, they're gonna not have a good time.
No, exactly. And it's usually on about a 300-word page. What's that, about six unknown words on a 300-word page, something like that.
I think one of the interesting things I read, and I'm not sure how your book came down on this, but one of the interesting things I seem to remember reading about extensive reading, and I think it might have been in Nation, was the actual acquisition of new items of vocabulary was relatively, or was less than they had kind of expected, or was not as high. It was, but they did feel like it perhaps had a good effect at reinforcing words, which were quite well learned. And I think Nation says that even though I think it's Nation, I could be wrong, even though the uptake of kind of brand new words was quite low, because extensive reading because you can do so much extensive reading, even if the amount is small, because there's such a large volume of it, it can be effective in that way. And I thought, if I'm remembering that correctly, it was interesting.
That's probably true. I think the main thing is that so long as the conditions are right, I mean, if there's too many words that are unknown, then the pickup rate is going to be small, because there's just going to be too many barriers for incidental gains to occur. So that's why, again, if you're reading at that sort of 98% level where there's very few unknown words, those unknown words are actually going to stand out and jump out at you.
Yeah.
And so there was a couple of interesting studies that highlight this. And one was a really old study by Paul Nation. I think he was supervising it, which was the first Clockwork Orange study, back in the late 70s. And that book, for anyone who's not aware, contains a language within it, a dialect within it called Nadsat, I think, is that correct?
Yeah.
And there's so many of those words in the text, and there's no way of knowing them. I think it closely relates some Russian dialect or something, but there's no way the students could know what those words mean. There's no dictionaries for it. There's no way of looking it up. And so that book was given to, I think, native speakers, and they weren't told what they were going to be tested on or anything, but after they read the book, they were tested on a section of these Nadsat words. And I think the pickup rate, the comprehension level of those words, just from reading alone, because there couldn't have been any other way, was over 70%. So that was quite impressive. And then I think, who was it? I
think the Clockwork Orange study is in the Krashen book, isn't it? On the power of reading.
Yeah. Well, Krashen then replicated this with foreign language students and found the pickup rates were a lot lower.
Right.
I think
Yeah, I
sort
think
of
there's a
6% or
40% figure that you quoted somewhere, and I remember thinking that sounds about right to me, because I I have a thing about the concept of guessing words from context and how effective that is, and I think that is about somewhere between 20 to 40% effective. So there are always going to be words which, I mean, as a native speaker, I read the newspaper sometimes. What am I now, 43? And I read the newspaper and I come across words, and I'm an English teacher, and I think, I don't know what that means, and I'm never able to guess what they mean. And I know 99% of the words. So there are times, I guess, when
sure.
it's
yeah, I don't think guessing is probably one of the more effective ways of picking up. But generally, if the context around the word is known enough, you should be able to sort of get some idea of it. And then the more you see that word within other contexts, that starts becoming a bit more clear. And I think that's the key. So it's about seeing that word in different contexts and seeing that word over and over. And so the conditions have to be right. So for one, you have to know most of the words in the text for that to occur.
Cool.
And then you have to see that same word repeat so many times. And I think there was another study by Palater Sanchez, if that's how you pronounce her name. She was one of Norbert Schmidt's students. I think she's got a PhD now. I don't know where she's teaching now. But yeah, one of her studies involved eye tracking and comprehension. And she was seeing, well, basically, she was aware that when you come across a word that you don't know, you spend longer fixating on that word than words that you already comprehend automatically.
I thought that study was really interesting. I will let you finish, but I think you say in the book that they fixate on the words longer when they don't know the words, and then after like 10 or 8 or 10 times of encountering it, the fixation reduces.
Yeah,
I thought that was a really interesting study, because you could draw two conclusions from that. One of the conclusions could be that and I'm trying to think of my own experience of reading in a foreign language. One of the conclusions could be that they've kind of learned the word, or at least they've become familiar with the word, or they've learned the meaning of the word. Another is that they've kind of learned to recognize that as a word that they don't know and say, oh, it's that word again. Oh, it's that word again. Oh, yeah.
Sure. Well, with her study, she had a comprehension measure as well in place.
Oh, did she? Okay.
So she did, yeah. So she was actually checking that they were comprehending those words, as well as like fixating for less time. And what she found was that those fixations reduced and the comprehension measures increased at about 8 opportunities to seeing that word over and over. So that was, and I think other estimates were around 10, between 10 and 20 times. I mean, obviously, the more you see it, the better.
Yeah.
But she seemed to sort of think around 8 was a reasonable amount. So so it can happen, but it has to keep happening, because there's another study. I think
this is actually one of the criticisms of extensive reading I've seen, and there aren't that many, but with words which are fairly uncommon, like higher level, there might not be enough exposure.
Right.
To those.
That's absolutely right. So you're talking about low frequency words.
Low frequency, yeah.
So when we talk about high frequency now, we're talking about words within the 1,000 most frequent words. And then there's now a mid-frequency range, which I think takes that up to about the 8,000 or 9,000 level. And then anything beyond that is low frequency.
Yeah.
And you're absolutely right. You know, the less frequent a word becomes, the less often you're going to see it. So, so then, it does become a problem for sure. It's a lot easier when you're dealing with lower levels. For example, low-level braided readers, those words will repeat more and more. So you're going to get those gains a lot more efficiently. When we start jumping sort of beyond those levels, then it becomes a bit more problematic. But Paul Nation has been writing mid-frequency readers to try and bridge that gap and help with that. So I'm not quite sure how he's working the sort of recycling of words to make sure that those words get repeated enough.
Maybe a lot of people who are hard of hearing in the text. I'm sorry, could you say that again?
So but he's written books designed for those levels. So I would imagine that's been, knowing Paul or knowing his work, has probably sort of considered. But it will become more problematic the less frequent the words become. Yeah.
Sure. Yeah, but I mean, you can't have everything. Okay. So I'm conscious of the time, and I've kept you both for a very long time. I just want to finish by asking, maybe Sue, you could say who would you say is the kind of who should buy this book? Who is this book for? Everybody,
Well,
of course, everybody.
yeah.
Specific.
I think it's primarily for teachers. I mean, we tried to write it in, the first part is about the research. Then we've got about 59, 60 activities of all different levels and types. And then we have some ways of how those activities can be used in different situations. And then we have a little bit about action research at the end. So we tried to write it in a very approachable way so that it's mainly for teachers. This is the background. This is why extensive reading is so important. And here's what you can do about it. And hopefully it's primarily for you, the teacher. I think inevitably it will get into university departments, and hopefully it will get onto, MA courses and Delta courses, hopefully, and that kind of thing. But primarily for teachers, I think, to really get to grips with extensive reading.
Yeah, and as I say, it's a very practical book. A large section of it is kind of, this activity for this level, and this is how you do it, which is really good.
And all linked to the research. I mean, that's the other.
That's a very I've never seen that before in a book, I don't think. But every activity has a kind of research box saying, which must have been incredibly time-consuming to source all of that research. Because I think, what did you say, there were 50 activities?
I think there were 59 in the end, 59 activities. But we thought it was important to say to teachers, look, this is an activity and it's a fun activity to do. It's an interesting activity for the classroom, but it's also linked to the research and it is effective.
I think the key thing there that made it a little easier than perhaps you've suggested there is that we actually started with a research for this and then thought about the kind of activities that teachers would need to sort of, help motivate learners. And so we started with that as a starting point. Or if there were a few activities that we kind of talked about as well, we'd sort of think that would really help with this, but we'd discussed this a lot. And so we were pretty clear on the research before the activity was sort of designed. So, so it kind of happened as a kind of natural process, really. But yeah, it did take quite a lot of time to put this together.
Having just finished a book, I sympathise. Yeah, it's a long, hard.
Yeah, but it was fun because we're both passionate about extensive reading, and getting the message across is part of the fun of it.
Yeah.
Okay, well, thank you both very much for giving up time on your Sunday.
Yeah, Sunday.
Sunday. Okay, I'm not sure because we're all in very strange time zones, and I hope the book is a great success.
Thanks, Ross.
Thank you.
Thanks. It was great.
Cheers.